Hi, I'm Reverend Terri with Many Journeys MCC in San Mateo, and I want to start by acknowledging that the existence of LGBTQ plus people is as old as, well, people, and there's plenty of evidence for that. In many cultures, the existence of a third gender was celebrated, as it was with the Native Americans who inhabited the land I live on. Anyway, we should be very suspicious of any history that simply ignores those who are sexual or gender minorities, because we've been there all along. And we should also acknowledge that our queer ancestors didn't look, sound, or have the same opportunities we have today. That didn't make them any less our ancestors. It just means that we sometimes have to look a little closer to find them. It means we need to read old texts as much as we can in their own cultural context, and it means we need to open our minds and hearts to them. I want to talk about our queer ancestors in biblical history. That might sound funny to you, but it's true. There are many figures that, with the modern reader's eyes and in historical context, look decidedly queer. Let's start with the most obvious love story of all, the story of Jonathan and David. In 1 Samuel chapter 18, Jonathan and David make a covenant because Jonathan loved him as his own soul. In 2 Samuel, the first chapter, the text says explicitly, David loved Jonathan more than women. Now, many argue they were just good friends. After all, Jewish men at this time did not have close platonic relationships with women. Men and women were kept pretty much apart unless they were related in some real way. It wasn't odd to have close friendships between men. And it's also true that this story is very similar to other Greek texts about warrior lovers. All men, whatever their sexuality, were expected to marry and have children, unless they were eunuchs. But many men also engaged in homosexual sex, some occasionally, some regularly. Some of these men were bisexual, and some were more serious and romantic about their male lovers than they were about their wives. So I think that we should accept David's statement at face value. The emotional, romantic, sexual love between Jonathan and David was more wonderful than the romantic, emotional, and sexual love between David and his wives. David was bisexual. Jonathan was the beloved, and that made Jonathan's father, the king, mad enough to make attempts on David's very life. Jonathan, you see, is the king's son. Really, he needed to produce an heir, and it seems he might not have been very interested. In the book of Matthew, chapter 5, we find a gay centurion, a Roman soldier and an officer. This centurion comes to Jesus asking that his servant, his pais, be healed. And Jesus heals the pais and then says to the centurion that he's never seen such faith. Now, there's a common practice at this historical time period of soldiers keeping younger male lovers. Often they were debt slaves. It also wasn't unusual for them to be freed and adopted after their time of service was over, the only way that they could become family. And there are many Greek words translated as servant or slave. This text uses pais. And in common Greek usage, this name often referred to these gay relationships. So if the slave was the centurion's boyfriend, and I think he was, it's noteworthy that Jesus has no problem with their relationship. This is not an endorsement for indentured slavery in our own time and place, nor for any kind of pedophilia. We know these things are harmful now. And the text must be read in its own history. And in its own history, we see a gay soldier and Jesus healing his partner with no disapproving words, instead exactly the opposite, a comment about his deep faith. We have a queer water carrier in Mark 14. Jesus says to a disciple, go into the city and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. Say to the owner of the house that he enters, the teacher asks, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And then the owner will show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready. Make preparations. We might ask, why in a crowded city would Jesus ask them to find a man carrying water? Wouldn't they be all over? Well, at this time in history, it was women that carried the water, which is why this gender non-conforming person was so easy to pick out in the crowds that had gathered. Now, it's possible he was a member of the Essenes, a Jewish sect of men who didn't associate with women, but this wouldn't make the choice to be water carrier any less notable. But we also have to notice, he doesn't appear to be leading the disciples to a monastery. He's leading them to an upper room in a home, a room that normally at Passover time would be filled with family. Is it possible that this non-gender conforming person had made his own family and was alone with his boyfriend for the holidays? There's another story of an Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8. He isn't named. As CoastPride puts it, this nameless Ethiopian eunuch was a triple outsider, a gender variant foreigner for a racial minority. And his experience shows that the early Christians welcomed all kinds of outcasts. The term translated eunuch included a variety of sexual minorities that today might be called queer or LGBT. Philip could be then considered the patron saint of LGBTQ allies as he reaches out to this eunuch. And his feast day, Philip's feast day, October 11th, National Coming Out Day. Now, we don't find as many women in the text because in most of biblical history, women had no power to choose not to marry, no legal agency of their own, but there are some exceptions. In this story, Paul has a vision of a Macedonian man asking for Paul to come and preach to him. And so he follows his vision. And when he arrives in this community, he encounters a community that's actually led by a woman, Lydia, a strong, independent businesswoman, a seller of purple cloth. She has a home large enough to house the Apostle Paul and those who are traveling with him. A new church forms in her home following the visit. Paul goes looking for a man and finds a woman, and he speaks to her. This is against custom. Then he goes to a house full of women and speaks to them. This is against custom. Lydia is independent. This is against custom. Lydia and her entire household are baptized. She is head of a household, unheard of, and I believe a queer ancestor. In Outing the Bible by Nancy Wilson, she notes that in Homer the Iliad, it mentions two women who were famous for the art of purple dyeing in the city of Lydia, founders of a tradition of women makers and sellers of purple dye. So could this have been an acceptable profession for a woman to be granted her independence? It's a mystery, but there she is. And in Acts chapter 20, the Apostle Paul stops by the island of Mytilene. Mytilene is actually the name of the capital city on the island of Lesbos. Want more? Go to CoastPride.net for a bountiful collection of queer saints worth remembering. And you might want to get the book Outing the Bible by Reverend Dr. Nancy Wilson. There are other resources too. With an open mind and heart, go looking. Thanks for listening.